As much as I enjoy the New Testament, we were in the New Testament for a very, very long time recently. You'll forgive me if I'm going to just try to sit and take it easy so I get all the way through this, because it's really good stuff. And let's see if I can survive this, shall we? But it's nice to spend a little bit of time in the Old Testament. It's a huge misunderstanding to characterize the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament as different people. It's the same. And we find the grace of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament just like we do in the New Testament. And Abraham is one of the best stories of this. So, last week we started this new series called Promise. And I was searching for a word because I thought covenant is so clunky. But covenant is the idea of a promise. It's the idea of a bargain or a deal sometimes. But I think in God's language, it is really a promise. There is many of God's promises come throughout the Bible, but there's big ones. And there's big ones in the Old Testament that we're going to pay attention to. But first, a little bit of a background on the idea of covenants in the ancient world. I wanted to give this to you last week, but of course I couldn't be here. But I want to make sure that you have this little bit of a background. There's three kinds of covenants in the ancient world and in the Old Testament specifically. The first one is something called a royal grant. And this is a forever promise. A royal grant, if I'm a king and I make a promise to you and you're not a king, and it's a promise forever, that's what I mean by a royal grant. And if you think about the promise that Noah received that you heard a little bit about last week, this is that kind of promise, a royal grant. It's a forever promise. You're not going to lose it. Your heirs are a different story, perhaps. Maybe in this particular kind of promise in the ancient world, I might promise you something, and then your descendants might start behaving in a way that makes that promise no longer something that applies to them. So it feels like sometimes it can be semi-unconditional, if that makes any sense. And some of God's promises seem to be like this. Then there's something else called a parity covenant. This is basically a sales deal. This is a bargain I make with you. I sell you my lawnmower for $100 because I don't need it anymore. You give me $100, I give you the lawnmower. That's a business deal. What very often happens, and you'll see this in the Bible where people make a deal or kings make a treaty, these are parity covenants. Now, I will tell you that this, although it's very common in the ancient world, a parity covenant is not very common with God. In fact, there are none of them because God has no equals. So God never strikes a deal that's this kind of a deal. And finally, there's something that I'm calling, just for lack of a better word, a conditional covenant. It has a fancy name that I find really annoying, and nobody seems to have come up with something better. It's called a suzerain vassal covenant. I know, you'll die. There will not be a test at the end of this sermon. But I will say that this is also not a covenant between equals. This is also where a great king makes a promise or makes a deal with a lesser king. The less important person might promise love and loyalty to the king, and the king promises something in return. And some of God's promises in the Old Testament seem to look like this too. So, with all of the promises in the Old Testament, there's promises that people make to each other, promises people make to God, promises God makes to man. I want to focus during this series, during Lent, on 5 major promises that God makes through the Old Testament that they're more awesome than any other promises ever in many ways. and they seem to kind of build on one another. So last week, again, you heard Caleb talk about a promise that God made to Noah. I made this terrible thing happen. I flooded the earth. I will never do that again. And every single time, it's funny. If you ever have a kid who goes to science class and the teacher asks them to explain why a rainbow happens, if the kid answers the teacher and says, rainbows happen because God promised that would never happen again. That's actually the right answer. So if they get in trouble, you should argue with the teacher. No. That's why there's a rainbow. The rainbow is the reminder of the promise of God that he would never do that again. It was a promise that God made unconditionally to everyone, to every living creature, to every human, to every person. Now, as our grand story of God's promise goes on, and God's promises goes on, we will see them change. We will see them grow. This week, we have a promise to a man named Abram. Noah's promise was to every single living thing. Abram's promise is only to Abram and his descendants. And if you're not real familiar with the Old Testament and you haven't read it a lot, first of all, Genesis is a great place to start. It's an amazing story. And it's got lots of really juicy bits and violence. So, it's really great stuff. Maybe not for the really little kids. There's some stuff in there that might be a little scary for the really little kids. Genesis is my favorite Old Testament book. Great stories in there. But if you're not real familiar and you don't read a lot, sometimes people hear the name Abram and they get a little confused. Because his name starts out Abram, means exalted father. And that's going to change, but not right now. We'll get to that. Now, this particular promise is not God's first promise to Abram. And we're not really told enough in Scripture to know exactly why God has chosen Abram above other people on the planet. But for some reason, God has singled out Abram. It might have something to do with the fact that even though Abram makes some really interesting mistakes, when God says, hey, I want you to do this, Abram basically just drops everything and does that. He just does. God promises Abram, before this chapter actually, that he will be the father of a great nation if he leaves his father's land. So Abram leaves. This all happened before what we heard today. Now, keep in mind, his wife, Sarai, is unable to have children, and they are both now too old. So, he's trusting in God's promise somehow, even though he can't see a way that it can happen. So, a little later, he promises Abram a specific land, and this is the land of Canaan, which is basically the land of modern-day Israel, where Abram's descendants will live forever. So, at this point, because this is later, Sarai is still not pregnant, she's still barren, and she's still too old. He then promises Abram something extraordinary in the chapters right before today's scripture. He promises Abram that he will have descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky. Now, this is hyperbole. God is making this grand, just in case you wonder, this is really, and I always find this interesting. First, he promises that he's going to have descendants as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. And then he promises that he's going to have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. It's interesting to note that there are far more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the seashores in the world. So God is just going over and over and going beyond and beyond. Oh, I'm going to bless you so much you can't believe it. You just can't believe it. And it's interesting that he chose the sand first and then the stars, because in the ancient world, they didn't know there were more stars in the sky than sand on the seashore, and they might not have made that assumption, because it was only the stars you could see. There were no telescopes. There was no Hubble. So it's interesting that God put the hyperbole in that order. That's always very interesting to me. So it was really important in the ancient world to have offspring, to have progeny. It remains very important to so many of us today. In the early years of America, and not just America, but a lot of places, people had a lot of kids because they needed all that work on the farm. And they needed to make sure that they had the people to do the work. And also, they wanted to make sure that their family name continued to live on, because they wanted to somehow pursue an immortality that would somehow provide. It's interesting, we do very interesting things to try to touch immortality in our life. And this may seem disconnected, but it really isn't. I remember one particular time a few years ago, I was working in Pennsylvania, and I didn't know that this was a normal occurrence at the time. But somebody walked into our building and they said, "Oh, the Goodyear blimp's out there." I said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, the Goodyear blimp's out there." So I looked out the window. No, it wasn't like this big off in the distance. It was like this big right above our building. It was like right above our building. So I had my camera at work. I grabbed my camera and I went outside. I ran outside and I shot this photo. And that's actually not cropped that far. That thing was huge. You could see the whatever they are trailing off the front of it. I thought, wow, I've seen something special. I've almost touched it. It's like being a part of something that's bigger than me. I later then learned that because our building was right next to Interstate 80, and because the Goodyear blimp had to travel back and forth along major highways to get to sporting events, that in that particular location, you saw the Goodyear blimp about 20 times a year, maybe more. So it wasn't that special. It was special to me at the time. Here's another example of what I mean by touching immortality. I have known a handful of people that collect signed photos of celebrities. Does anybody do this? It's something that sometimes a lot of folks will do because it just makes them feel connected to something big. It makes them feel connected to something that is larger than themselves. And that's the same impulse, I think, that drives us to try to find a connection to immortality. This is how often we feel about our children as well. It's why, for instance, I've known folks that when they married, and the wife was the only child of someone who treasured their family name, she might not change her last name when they got married. That's pretty normal these days. It wasn't even 30 years ago when I got married, but it's pretty normal these days. Or a father who has a son will take a certain extra amount of pride when that son has another son, and he knows that when he is gone, his family name will continue. It's a little bit of touching immortality. It's like I continue to live in the person of this little baby who will live far beyond my lifespan. And this is how Abraham feels more than we do today, because it was a very keenly felt emotion in the ancient world, that the only way that he would be significant is if he somehow, the name of Abraham lived on past his own lifetime. So he has been promised now that he is going to have descendants. Now, I'd love to tell you that Abram was this very pious person who simply took God at his word and waited for it to happen. But in reality, if you read the Bible, that's not what Abram does. And it's not what Sarai does. Instead, what happens is Sarai says, you know what? I'm not having a baby anytime soon. Why don't you have a baby with my maid? And then we'll have this taken care of. And so that's exactly what they do. I don't know how to explain, I've never figured out a way to explain why this is normal in the ancient world because it's so weird to us today. I don't know anybody that would ever do this. But in this particular case, she says, you know what, we'll just go ahead. We'll do it this way. And so Ishmael is born first. Ishmael is the son of Abram's efforts. Mark that. Ishmael is the son that is born because Abram says, here's what I'm going to do to make God's will for my life happen. How often do I do that? How often do I try to impress God with my own efforts instead of waiting to see what God will do? More often than I would probably care to ever admit. But it's such a great object lesson. And even at the point when God comes to Abram and he says, you're going to have a child through Sarai. Her name hasn't changed yet. You're going to have a child through Sarai. He literally asks God, he says, why don't you just bless Ishmael? Because this Sarai thing is not going to happen. He's 99 years old. She's 90. And God is saying, no, you are going to have a child with Sarai. And that is the way that I'm going to bless the world through you. So God's promise is you went ahead. And I love that God doesn't just it would be so easy if God just said, you know what, you didn't wait for me to solve the problem, so I'm just going to go to your cousin or somebody else, and I'm just going to start again. Because if you look at Scripture, that's kind of what God did with Noah. He said, these people are a pain in the neck. I'm just going to start again. Here's Noah. I'll start with Noah. But God is in the business of making something new out of you and out of me. He's in the business of saying, okay, you decided you were going to do it in your own strength. And it didn't work out. But I look at you and I say, I can work with that. God looks at you and he says, I can work with that. And so God comes to Abram. God says, we're going to do this again. We're going to do this my way. By the way, God still blesses Ishmael. He doesn't leave Ishmael out in the cold. He blesses Ishmael. Ishmael becomes the father of literally every single member of the Arab nations that exist down to today. But this next son will be the result of God's doing. He's named Isaac because when Sarai gets the promise, she laughs because it's so ridiculous. And Isaac means laughter. So the child's name is Isaac, and they're always reminded all their lives that they laughed at God's promise, and God still loved them so much that God kept that promise. Just by the name of their child, I think that's marvelous. Just marvelous. It is so impossible what God is about to do that only God could accomplish it. It is so impossible what God is about to do, maybe in your life, maybe in my life, that only God could accomplish it. I wonder what would happen if the church and the people of God took hold of that lesson from Abram's life. To say, God is about to do something so impossible in our midst, there's no way that it could ever be explained. From the time that God promises a natural-born son to the time when God delivers Isaac is 25 years, a quarter century. And then God does this wonderful thing where he changes their names. This is one of my favorite things in the Bible. I think I've mentioned it before. I think it's hilarious. I always like to think that Jesus was like just bad with names, so he just said, I don't like that name. I'll just make something up that I'm going to remember because this is what I remember about you. You guys are so obnoxious. I'm going to call you the sons of thunder. Your name is Simon, but you're a blockhead, so I'm going to call you Peter, which means rock, which I think means blockhead. I mean, things like this, I think Jesus is doing throughout the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, God's about this whole changing names thing too. And this changing names thing is really important. And I don't want you to miss it. Because when he changes these names, he's saying that the power of my promise, my covenant, is so amazing that it will change who you actually are. It says from the scripture today, and because I have made you the ancestor of many nations, your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham. As for your wife Sarai, you will no longer call her Sarai. Her name will now be Sarah. I will bless her and even give you a son from her. I will bless her so that when she will become nations and kings of peoples will come from her. Abram, which means exalted father or exalted ancestor, to Abraham, which means ancestor of a multitude. It just expands it. Sarai means princess. Sarah means, we think, princess of many. God doesn't change their identities. He completes them. Do you see that? They were incomplete until God's promise and God's miracle comes and takes hold of who they are and changes them to who God always meant that they would be. Why isn't the same thing true of you and me? It is true of you and me. You might notice that this promise to Abraham is conditional. It's not quite like the one to Noah. The one to Noah was to everybody. I'm never going to do this again. I don't care what they do. I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to flood the earth again. This one requires Abraham's participation. It says, walk with me and be trustworthy. I will make a covenant between us and I will give you many, many descendants. Abraham needs to walk with God and be trustworthy. By the way, he doesn't do a very good job of that in a lot of ways. From about the chapter 12 of Genesis on, you can read Abraham's story, and it is really good stuff. But he's a very flawed person, just like somebody you probably know really well, who doesn't always get it right, and who often gets it wrong, sometimes making the same mistake over and over again. And yet, the best promise is yet to come, and Abraham would never get to see it. The best promise is one that is not going to be conditional like this promise to Abram, to Abraham, to Sarai, to Sarah. The very best promise is the one that we are striving towards as we go through Lent. It's the promise that God gave when he sent his son. That's the very best promise. And that's the promise that will really change you, will really change me, that will change our names. That is the promise that changes us from wounded to healed, from lost to found, from suffering to saved. to beloved, from dust to eternal. I pray as we go through the rest of Lent that we will focus in on the amazing promise that God has given us, and he writes throughout the Old Testament into the New and into your life and into my life, that God is about the business of taking things and making them brand new. Taking things that are here today and gone tomorrow and turning them into things that will last forever. Taking people who are flawed and human, and we make the same mistakes over and over again, and turning us into the people that God fulfills his promises to the world through.